Okay, so thank you all for joining us today. My name is Shira Aroni Maklov. I'm a Director of Business Development at the FreeMind Group. And today we are going to discuss non-dilutive funding for clinical stage R&D. You'll have the PDF of today's presentation available for immediate download in the webinar slide bar under Handouts section. At the end of the presentation, we'll have enough time for Q&As. You are welcome to write them down under the questions section. And about us, you are welcome to find us at LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, our YouTube channel, where you can find past presentations and today's presentation as well. And I suspect it to be there in a few days. Okay, so let's begin. So let's start with a short introduction of the FreeMind Group. FreeMind is a consulting firm specializing in non-dilutive funding from U.S. sources. Actually, we are the global leader in non-dilutive funding. We've been around since 1999, about, 20 years now. We are 70 full-time employees. We have diverse client base. We work with academic institutes, universities, and industry, from small startups all the way up to big pharmaceutical companies. And in a year, we submit over 500 applications. We have very systematic and strategic approach towards non-dilutive funding, and we have a systematic way in order to maximize your funding potential. In a nutshell, we identified the most relevant funding opportunities, strategize to maximize the application's chance of success, manage complex project production processes. We lead joint application writing and support final contract negotiation. And at the end of the day, for us, it's really important to emphasize that non-dilutive funding is a strategic financial tool. Today, we are going to discuss a few sources that we target. The total pocket of money we're talking about is $50 billion annually. Most of it comes from the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, which is built of 27 institutes. Among them, you can find the NCI, National Cancer Institute, NINDS, National Institute for Neurological Disorders and Stroke, and many, many more. You have other we target other organizations such as BARDA, FDA, CDC, Department of Defense, U.S. Army, DARPA, DITRA, and private foundations as well. Gates Foundation, Michael J. Fox, and many more. Well, these sources, they fund everything from discovery to late phase 3 clinical trials. Obviously, today we're going to focus on phase 1 to phase 2 to 3 clinical trials. And in terms of money, in terms of the budget, we're talking about $500,000 a year. It depends, of course, on the mechanism, and we're going to discuss that later. And up to a few millions of dollars, more than $3.5 million for more advanced stage clinical trials, let's say for phase 2B, phase 3 clinical trials. So the 2018 NIH budget just approved. We're talking about $37 billion for 2018. Last year it was $34 billion, so we definitely see an increase in that. And out of the $37 billion, we see that about most of the money and the vast majority of the NIH budget, about $28 billion to be exact, is devoted for extramural research. Basically, it's research that is done outside the NIH itself, such as research project grants and R&D contracts. Since this number, $28 billion, is accurate for last year, and the budget was just increased, we estimate it to be about $32 billion for 2018. Looking at the categorical spending of the NIH for 2018, you can see that almost $10 billion out of the $37 billion go to clinical research. We're talking about clinical research and trial, about $3 billion go to clinical trials. We see that this money goes to clinical trials in all kind of indications, if it's cancer, infectious diseases, neuroscience, and any indication possible, basically, because the NIH really covers everything. As you can see here, you can see some of the other indications and the categorical spending for each one of them. And the message here is that no matter what is your field of research, there will always be funding for you, especially from the NIH. As I said, 27 institutes, each one of them is for a specific or more than just one indication in the life sciences. So there is money out there for you. So talking about clinical trials, basically under not just the NIH, but there are some specific mechanisms used to fund clinical trials. We're talking about phase 2 or fast track SBIR, R01, U01, UH3, and BBA. And today we're going to discuss each one of them and give some examples. Well, this is, I guess, the most important slide in this webinar. So turn up the volume and listen carefully. So basically, due to the size of the awards for clinical stage projects, the funding institutes and organizations have more requirements for the potentially awarded organization compared to an organization that just won a preclinical award. Essentially, and we see it constantly every year. The NIH and other funding organizations prefer to give the grants to the most serious and prepared organization that can prove that the planned clinical trials are about to start soon, as they are described in the application. So bottom line here is that the more advanced you are, the more prepared you are. If you have a letter of support from the clinical sites and from the PIs showing that you are about to start your research soon, you start the clinical trials soon, the better are your chances to win the awards. Basically, they want to reduce their risk by giving grants to some company that is not prepared yet. You need to convince the PO that your risk is low and that the clinical trials will be conducted successfully. So before we go over the requirements and recommendation, it's important to say that each solicitation, each organization, each institute, usually they have their own requirement and recommendation, but we managed to sum up all the requirements and recommendation that usually the institutes and organization, what they ask for. So first, a company should have an IND from the FDA or a local equivalent regulatory approval to conduct actually the clinical trials. Usually, the IND or the equivalent is required by the time the clinical trials start, but there are specific cases and institutes that require the IND by the time of submitting the application, such as the NINDS, for example. This is also applied to the IDE for medical devices, a regulatory approval from the FDA for medical devices. Okay, the clinical protocol. It is highly recommended to have the full clinical protocol by the time of submission, as it shows how prepared you are towards the trials. The clinical protocol could be approved by the FDA or equivalent before the trials themselves, okay? But not at the time of the submission. Basically, the clinical protocol covers the investigator's brochure, the clinical sites, site PIs, IRBs, which is the Institutional Review Board. All of them are not required by the time of submission, but if you don't have a finished clinical protocol, but do have some of the above, investigator's brochure or clinical sites that are already approved, you have a better chance to win the awards. Regarding the IRBs, recently, the NIH has demanded that a single-site IRB should supervise the rest of the sites in case of multiple sites. So if you can justify how prepared you are towards the clinical trials by adding letters of support from the sites that they accept the IRB, by all means, do it. And I guess most importantly, contact the PO, the program officer, in advance. Make sure the solicitation fit your research. Make sure they are interested in funding your area of research. It can save you many hours of preparing the application and preparing it and writing the application. So make sure you contact PO in advance. Okay, so let's talk about the first mechanism, which is not actually for clinical trials themselves, but for planning. It's a planning grant, R34. So the clinical trial planning grants, they support establishment of the research team, development of tools for data management and research oversight, development of a trial design, finalization of the protocol itself, the clinical protocol, and pilot studies or collection of feasibility data for research project. So basically, that helps you to plan your clinical trials, and usually each one of the clinical trial planning grant have their own opportunity to fund the clinical trial itself. And we'll talk about them later. Just for example, the regular clinical trial planning grant, the funding is up to $450,000 over up to 3 years. And again, it designate for permit early peer review of the rationale and concept for the proposed clinical trials, support development of essential elements for clinical trials, and lead to an application for support of a full-scale trial based on elements developed under the planning period. Usually they have 3 deadlines, rolling deadlines throughout the year: February, June, and October, and February 16th is the closest one. As you can see here, there are some some clinical trial planning grants for each institute. You can see here the NIA, National Institutes of Aging, National Institutes of the Eye, NIAID for Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NHLBI for heart, lung, and blood. So each one of the institutes, usually they have their own planning grant, and you can find another mechanism which is paired to the planning grant, such as the R1 and U1, where you can basically use it to fund your clinical trials itself. But again, it's important to say that if you don't submit a planning grant or win a planning grant, you can still submit and win the grant for clinical trials itself. So let's talk about the clinical trial funding mechanisms under the NIH. Okay, let's start with the NIH Research Project Grant, which is the parent R1 for clinical, which require a clinical trial. Basically, this is a parent announcement, omnibus, an open call as we call it, where you need to submit an application describing your scientific goals, and everything in between. And there are some institutes in the NIH that participate this opportunity. In this case, you can find the NHLBI, NIA, NIAID, NIAMS, and NINDS. All of them participate in this application. Basically, the funding here as it's written, the application budget are not capped, however, must reflect the scope of work. But historically, we know that they give you up to $5,000 a year for for 5 years period, which means $2.5 million direct cost. I know that they write that the application budget is not capped because they want you to ask for a larger budget, more than $5,000 a year, in advance. And if you do so, they can approve your request, of course, and give you the amount of money that you need. So the scope of work, as I said, the grant support project in the area of representing specific interest of the institutes themselves. Of course, NIAID will fund projects in the scope of allergy and infectious diseases and so on. And this parent funding opportunity requires that at least one clinical trial will be proposed. The next deadline is June 5th, 2018. So as there are, and another important thing that I forgot to mention, the NIDDK, which is the National Institutes for Digestive Diseases, Diabetes, and Kidney Diseases, they just announced last week that they are willing to pay more than, well, in total, the budget for the Parent Hour 1 is $2.5 million direct cost. And as we said, it's $500,000 a year. And they said that they are willing to spread the payments throughout the 5 years period unevenly. So if you need $1 million the first year, and then $2 million the second year, and $500,000 the third year, they will give you that if you can, of course, justify it through the application and your plan. So that's an important point, and we expect the other institutes to do that as well in the future. So I presented the Parent Hour 1 that is open for a few institutes under the NIH, but each institute have their own solicitation for clinical trials. For example, this one is the NCI investigator-initiated early phase clinical trials for cancer treatment and diagnosis. The budget here is limited to less than $5,000 a year in direct cost, of course, of a period of 5 years. And of course, they fund projects early phase 0, 1, and 2 in the scope of work of cancer treatment and diagnosis. And the deadline here is June 5th, 2018. Another mechanism is the UO1. We talked about our 1 till now. And this mechanism is the UO1, and it is the cooperative agreement with the NIH. It's the NIAID Clinical Trial Implementation Cooperative Agreement. As I said, NIAID is for allergy and infectious diseases, and basically that means that you have collaboration with the NIH. It's not a grant that they just give you the money and you should justify in the application what you're going to do with the money. Here they are more involved. The NIH is more involved with the work. The funding here, the application budget are not capped, but must reflect, of course, the scope of work. They fund implementation of investigator-initiated high-risk clinical trials and mechanistic studies, of course, with the association of the NIAID Institute. That means in the scope of work of allergy and infectious diseases. And the deadline is next month, May 14th, 2018. Well, another mechanism that could be used for clinical trials, to fund clinical trials, is the SBIR. SBIR, obviously, as you probably know, is a great mechanism for US companies only. Basically, it's for small businesses like the SME in Europe under Horizon 2020. So US companies that can submit and win SBIR can submit this NIAID SBIR Phase 2 clinical trial implementation cooperative agreement. And basically they said that the budget is about $150,000 for Phase 1 awards and about $1.5 million for Phase 2 awards. Here they can say that NIH can apply for a waiver from SBA to issue an award exceeding $1.5 million for Phase 2. So that's, again, an option. They support implementation of clinical trials for small businesses that propose clinical trials in the research area of NIAID, of course. And the proposed clinical trial should be very milestone driven. That's very important. And the deadline here is May 14, again, 2018. Another mechanism which you can use is the UG3, Clinical Coordinating Center for Multi-Site Investigator-Initiated Clinical Trials. This one is, basically, application budget here are not limited, but need to reflect the actual needs. And here, the scope of funding is to development and implementation of a clinical coordinating center for investigator-initiated multi-site clinical trials, Phase 2 and beyond. It's really important to pay attention to that. This is under the NHLBI, the National Institutes for Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And they said also that both a clinical coordinating center application and collaborating data coordinator center, and this is actually the collaboration, must be submitted on the same application due date for consideration by NHLBI. So I gave you few mechanisms that could be applicable for clinical trials, and you can use each one of them, of course, if they are relevant for what you do, in order to fund your clinical trials. There are so many solicitations, and under the NIH, you can see here some examples of different institutes under the NIH. You can see here the NII, NIBIB for NIDDK. You can see many institutes here that they have specific solicitations for clinical trials under the NIH. Again, here you can see here more solicitations. Here it's CNS, PNS Related Opportunities. I thought it could be interested under NINDS. But more importantly, it's really important to remember that if you don't find a specific solicitation that could match and fit your R&D activities and clinical trials, that's okay. You can always use the parent announcement, the R1 that give you a pretty generous award, and it's an open call. You basically can submit any application regarding your R&D activity, and if they like that, they can actually fund your project, of course, under the relevant institute under the NIH. So we talked about the opportunities themselves, the solicitations. Let's talk about the NIH review process. It's really important. After the application is submitted, there will be an external peer review with the experts from the project's field. They examine the risk and the strength of the application by measuring 5 parameters: whether the project is innovative, does it significant to the science world, does your project could become a solution for unmet need, or do you have the right leadership to manage the project, if the PI has the right expertise, and if you have the right environment, the lab space and tools to support your research. And most importantly, they examine your scientific approach, your scientific aims and goals that you want to achieve. Well, and at the end of the day, great science, and we see it every year, great science win awards. But it doesn't mean your application should just focus on that. In order to score high in these 5 parameters, you should also know how to write your application, how to present your science in the best way there is in order to make it compelling and attractive. Well, we talked about the NIH. Let's talk about another great organization, which is called BARDA, Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. So BARDA just received a new budget of more than $1 billion, approved to develop, procure medical countermeasures that addressed chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear accidents and attacks, pandemic influenza, and emerging infectious diseases. Basically, BARDA, they claim to bridge the infamous valley of death, but by taking phase 1 completed projects that have shown, of course, solid preclinical data and have good safety profiles, and move them forward again in the area of CBRN, influenza, and emerging infectious diseases to phase 2 and beyond. So basically, they fund phase 2 and on, and helping companies to avoid the valley of death that I presented. Oh, and this is their solicitation for all of the indications I just mentioned and that are written here. Usually, last year they had 3 different solicitations, but today they have just one for all of the indications mentioned. Okay, so their submission and review process is a bit different from the NIH review and submission process. Basically, first of all, BARDA is probably one of the most welcoming agencies out there. Prior to submitting an application, you take a part of the Tech Watch program, which is a great program that we really recommend you to use. Basically, you meet with the program officers and get some feedback on your work. And you should definitely get in touch with one of them and try to understand their needs and interests prior to trying to submit an application. We have great experience with BARDA and it's really recommended. So usually, let's take a look about the submission process. We start with a white paper, also called a pre-application. It's basically limited to 5 to 10 pages long. 5 to 10 pages application. And the majority of the application do not make it past the white paper stage. And that means that if you are invited to submit the full application, your chances to win increase dramatically. So after that, you have another technical review and you enter to the negotiation stage. And if you got there, you're probably going to get the award. It's about negotiation about the award, the size of the award itself. So usually the BAAs, but the BARDA application, they don't have a budget cap. You shouldn't go crazy and ask for $1 billion, but you should not be afraid to ask for $20 million award if it is justified. So we really recommend you to ask for what you need, because if you ask for too much or too little, they will question if you really know what you are doing. Next is a great program, a new accelerator, which is called CARBAX. It's a partnership between BARDA, which I just presented, the Wellcome Trust, NIAID under the NIH, and their goal is to find antibacterial product, and that's their mission. They have a pretty generous budget. And basically, they fund everything in the infectious diseases world and antibiotic resistance, if you have a project related to that. They fund everything from preclinical and up to phase 1. So basically, in terms of clinical trials, phase 1 is fundable through the CARBAX program. So let's talk about the FDA. Not many people know that the FDA is not just a regulatory body, it also has a funding mechanism. This one is the clinical studies of safety and effectiveness of orphan product research project grant. This is, well, as it said, for rare diseases and orphan diseases. They fund phases 1 to 3 and up to $2 million. Well, this specific solicitation just expired last February. We just talked with one of FDA's program officer, and he said that this program, this solicitation, should be renewed very soon. So we estimate the next deadline to be in February 2018 and 19. So stay tuned. Okay, let's talk about Department of Defense. Most of the people think that Department of Defense, they also only fund combat-related projects, but this is not true. Through the CDMRP, the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program, they actually, which is for a program, special program for the soldiers, the veterans, and their families, they cover. This program cover many indications in the life sciences with a pretty generous budget. For 2017, it was more than $1 billion. The award can go up to $10 million. And as you can see here, the budget for breast cancer and general medical research and prostate cancer. So they have a pretty wide range of indications. Actually, the pre-announcement just were issued recently. And the solicitations and indications themselves start to be issued, well, basically now. A few of them have been issued, already have been issued. And again, their submission process is a bit similar to the BARDA submission process, with a white paper pre-application review process. Then you are invited to submit the full application, another review process, and then potentially you can get an award. So this is an example for one of the solicitation that already came out. The CDMRP Breast Cancer Research Program, Breakthrough Award, level 3 and 4, obviously level 3 for advanced translational studies, for, of course, clinical trials, small-scale clinical trials, and level 4 for a larger scale project. You can see here that the funding is pretty generous, as I said, about $4 million for level 3 plus indirect costs, and level 4, $10 million plus indirect costs. The deadline here is the deadline for the pre-application is pretty around the corner, May 15. And the full application, of course, if you are invited, should be in August 14, 2018. Well, these are the topics for of 2017. As I said, few, especially, well, breast cancer, lung cancer, and ovarian cancer. All of these solicitations already came out, but we're waiting for the rest of them. As you can see, there is a wide range of indications that should be issued any day now. So we talked about the organizations and institutes and specific solicitations as an example for the clinical trials opportunities that you have out there. Now we're going to talk about, well, non-dilutive funding as a strategic source of funding. We strongly recommend to turn non-dilutive funding into a strategic source of funding. Our clients invest about 5% of their fundraising effort in securing non-dilutive funding in order to maximize the company funding potential. More than just, well, the money, it has an added value. It's a stamp of approval from the US government that could be translated into additional private investments or even an exit in the future. So we see a lot of big value in non-dilutive funding, and that's why we encourage companies all over the world to invest their efforts in securing non-dilutive funding. So I described today a few ways to write, to include all of the parameters in the applications to make sure you write your scientific goals and make sure that your science is innovative enough. But in order to win you need to have a great science, most innovative science in the world, but also you need to write a great application that should be very attractive and compelling. And how do you do that? I'll give you about five points that you can use in order to write a great application. First one is know your weaknesses. If there are any gaps in your capabilities or expertise, you can always use an external assistant or collaborator. Find the right partner, if necessary, of course. The NIH really encourage collaborations between industry and academia, or between two companies in the industry. They really encourage that. So if you need it, find the right partner for you. Know the interest of the agency or the mechanism. As I said, talk to program officers. Use the TechWatch program in BARDA. Don't be afraid to use all of these sources in order to make sure that the solicitation or the opportunity fit your project in the best way there is. Address the non-important, very important admin parts in the application, and establish yourself both as a top researcher as well as an experienced manager. Make sure that you show them in the application that you can manage the funds, you can manage the projects more than, and of course, make sure that you are presented as a top researcher in the application. We in FreeMind, we have as I said, very systematic and strategic approach towards non-dilutive funding in order to maximize your funding potential. In a nutshell, we do that through two services that we offer. First, we identify all the relevant opportunities, funding opportunities out there. Then we create a multi-submission granting strategy for each one of your projects in your pipeline. And then we submit as many top quality applications as possible, because we know that the more you submit, the better are your chances. And that's what we do. Okay, so thank you all for attending this webinar today. As I said, I already put the PDF file in the handouts. You are welcome to join us next to our next webinar. It will be on Tuesday, May 8th, on the topic of biodefense and infectious diseases funding opportunities. For more information and in order to register, you can click the link I'm just going to put on the chat section in the slide bar. And of course, we'll look forward to see you there. And now I think it's a great time for Q&As. Let's see what we've got. Okay, I see some questions here that are very specific. Let's see. Yeah, I see some questions here that are very specific to the project that is presented. So I'll be happy to answer all of the questions here via email. Also, you are more than welcome to contact me. You have here my email address and my phone number. So I'll send you the presentation in a few days, and also it will be available at our channel at YouTube. So thank you all very much for attending today. It was a pleasure, and I hope to see you soon in our next webinar. Thank you.